Hello everybody and welcome to another video. I think you just watched the Soviet Union version of the early part of the Cold War, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the United States. And pretty much this entire period is backdropped by nuclear anxiety. As you know, both the United States and the Soviet Union have atomic bombs at this point, and we haven't talked about China at great length yet, but we'll talk about China and when they start getting atomic bombs and the hydrogen bomb, because they do eventually get theirs, but I don't think we talk about them for another 2 weeks or so, but we'll get there. So nuclear anxiety is really what backdrops this entire time frame, the whole Cold War. And I'm going to link also a video from YouTube. It's the duck and cover video, which maybe you've seen at some point in your life. It's sort of a joke these days, but at the time it really made sense. And when you watch the video, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a little turtle, how he has to duck and cover under his turtle, and it shows images of children in school ducking and covering underneath their school desks, and people in the streets. You just have to duck and cover under a bench or whatever you can. I mean, we know now that that's probably, or almost certainly, not going to protect you from a nuclear attack. But at the time, duck and cover was the best you could come up with, and it's about making people feel safe. It's a little surprising at this point that the atomic bomb hasn't been used again, given how big of a deal it was during the entire Cold War. People just imagined it happening to them, and so we get situations where lots of people, start building their bomb shelters. And the example I like to think of is the Blast from the Past. It was a movie from about 15 years ago at this point, where Christopher Walken and Sissy Spacek, they build their own bomb shelter, and a plane crashes on their house, and they think that while they were down there, and they thought that an atomic bomb was used, so they stay down there for so many years. But these bomb shelters were actually pretty popular, and you can still find fallout shelters around places like school campuses. And for example, my alma mater, Salisbury University, there is one building designated as the fallout shelter on campus, and the signs are still there today, because that's where you're supposed to go and hide if the Russians dropped a bomb on us. It's important to note during this time that there is a real fear about nuclear weapons being used, but there's also a real fear about communism and coming from the Soviet Union during this whole time period. So we get what's known as the Second Red Scare. The first Red Scare had happened much earlier in the 20th century, right at the end of World War I, when the Soviet Union fell, or became the Soviet Union, when Russia fell to communism, and we touched on that just a little bit in some of the earlier videos. But this second Red Scare, which really begins, for the second Red Scare really begins during the early part of the Cold War, and we'll go over some of the roots here. This whole battle between communism and capitalism, because they're on sort of opposite sides of the spectrum of economic style system. So there is a communist party in the United States, though. It starts in the 1930s. There had been a socialist party before, which a lot of us associate with communism and socialism. They're together. They're not exactly the same thing, but there does become a communist party in the 1930s due to the Great Depression. It grows a little, or at least they get sympathy. There's about 7,500 members before the Great Depression, and up to 50,000 members of the U.S. Communist Party during the Great Depression. But they also advocated for equal rights, which most of the country was not completely on board with, and equal rights for everybody, African Americans and other minority groups, which a lot of the country was still not 100% in favor of. So the Communist Party, I mean, 50,000 people sounds like a lot of people, but it never really takes off wide scale in the United States. The Communist Party in the United States was one of the first to come out early and strongly against fascism in the 1930s, when Mussolini had been in power for a little while and Hitler comes to power in Germany. They become even larger than the Socialist Party in the United States during the 1930s. And in response, we get this House of Un-American Activities Committee. HWAC is formed in 1938. It's initially formed to deal with anti-American propaganda, but it extends during this period to deal mostly with communism, or this Red Scare in the United States. Also, there's this thing called the Smith Act, passed in 1940. It makes it a crime to overthrow the U.S. government, which, I mean, that should be obvious, but it also makes it a crime to join a party that advocates overthrowing the U.S. government. And while the U.S. Communist Party never comes out and says to overthrow the government, part of communist rhetoric has to do with this worldwide revolution, this worldwide communist revolution, which we'll talk about more about once we get to China, because they talk a lot about the worldwide revolution. So this kind of halts a little bit with the alliance with the Soviet Union during the Second World War. They kind of pulled back on it because the Soviet Union was our second. It's physically the biggest ally, but kind of like the second biggest ally next to Great Britain. But so we team up with them. The U.S. teams up with the Soviet Union to fight the Nazis. So once that's over, that's when we get back to this. That's when the Red Scare really gets going in the U.S. There's also this elements of New Deal backlash. So the New Deal had been seen as sort of a socialist movement, and there's a little elements of socialism in the New Deal because there's more government oversight of the economy, and there are people worried that any state involvement means communism. So that was one of the big fears here. That kind of go along with that. We get Truman's government loyalty program. This comes out in 1947, and what this is, it requires security checks on all government employees to find out whether or not they're communists. And they don't find many communists, but this government loyalty program does sort of out a lot of homosexuals in working for the federal government. Part of capitalism versus communism is sort of a return to traditional values, and you'll see this a lot as we go along here. The United States is worried about this return to traditional values because communism is at its heart anti-religion. Karl Marx talked about the church, the religious institutions, as being detrimental to human activity, so people in general. So that's part of this return to traditional values with the government loyalty program. There are many critics, and many critics do charge that this doesn't really do anything except for out a bunch of homosexuals in the government. So there is a bit of a backlash to this government loyalty program as well. There are some other world events that lead to or add to communist fears in the United States. Chief among them would be the Soviet Union exploding their first nuclear bomb, and China going communist, falling to communism, which we'll talk about more next week, in 1949. Also the Korean War, because North Korea is a communist country as well. So there's some of these world events that are kind of scaring the United States in general about communism. There's also this fear in the United States, and it's sometimes legitimate, of communist espionage happening in the U.S. government. And the first case here is the Alger Hiss case. Alger Hiss was accused of giving secrets, government secrets, to the Soviet Union, and he was actually put on trial for this and found the statute of limitations had passed for convicting him of treason by the time he was put on trial, but he was gotten for perjury for lying on the stand about whether or not he sent sensitive information from the State Department. So this is just one U.S. communist espionage case. The other, what happens with the Rosenbergs is that Ethel's brother had actually worked on with the U.S. government at Los Alamos, and Los Alamos is where the United States were building and testing the first atomic bomb. This was during World War II. So Ethel's brother was working with that, and what Ethel's brother did is that he gave secrets, so nuclear secrets, to Julius, and Julius in turn sold those secrets to the Soviet Union. Now Ethel's brother was caught in 1950 and ended up snitching on Julius and Ethel to sort of save his own skin. The judge and prosecutors, it's I think important to note that the Rosenbergs, I mean, if you can tell from their last name, they're Jewish. Now the judge and prosecutors during their trial were also Jewish, and you think that, I mean, there was sort of an idea in the country that Jews would go easy on other Jews, but these particular prosecutors and the judge wanted to appear tough on traitors. So they convicted him, and Julius and Ethel were actually executed for treason. We know now that Julius was definitely guilty. There's no, 100% he actually did it. Ethel probably knew what was going on, but she wasn't directly involved, so she might have not deserved to be killed, but, or executed, so I guess there's a difference there. So, but it happened. They're both executed for treason, and these are two of the higher profile cases. You probably have heard of the Rosenbergs before right now. Which leads us to Senator Joseph McCarthy. He had been kind of an unknown senator from Wisconsin, of all places, but he really kicks the second Red Scare into high gear. In 1950, he gave his first "I've Got Names" speech, and you got to say that in air quotes. he delivers the speech in West Virginia, and sort of the big deal here is that he never really finds any communists in the U.S. government, but he engages in this multiple untruth sort of system of speeches. He delivers a number of speeches, and every time he delivers a speech, he says, well, I've got a different number of names in the U.S. government. In the first speech he delivered, he would say something like, I've got the names of 65 members of the U.S. government who are active communists. And then the next speech he would give, I've got the names of 75 U.S. government employees who are active communists. And it's just this series, which might have some parallels today, or might not, where he just keeps accusing people of things that aren't true. And eventually, it ends up that he doesn't really find anybody as the big outcome of the McCarthy witch hunt, if you will. And it's not just government employees that the Red Scare is targeting. We also, I mean, of course, it's government employees, number one, but there's also members, people in Hollywood, which you associate today. Hollywood is this bastion of liberalism. Well, it was seen that way in the 1950s, too. So there are members or people in Hollywood, actors and producers and directors, who were accused of being communists. Of all people who were familiar with Ronald Reagan, he named names. He was actually, before he was president, he was governor, but before he was governor, he was actually the president of the Screen Actors Guild. So he was a sort of a big deal in Hollywood. Now we get this this example here of the Hollywood 10. These are just 10 sort of high-profile directors and actors from this time frame. They refused to name names, so they sued based on their First Amendment rights, but they ended up becoming disgraced and blacklisted for most of the rest of their lives. In addition to government employees in Hollywood, bigwigs, foreigners are accused of being communists too. They're targets of this Red Scare witch hunt. Foreigners are, there's not so many immigrants now, but there are some Chinese coming in, sort of running away from the revolution going on in China, which we'll talk more about next week. Educators are another target of the second Red Scare for, I guess, obvious reasons. Even today, there's sort of this association with, with education being more of a liberal-leaning institution. It's not 100% true, but that comes out of this time frame where in the 1950s, sort of these high-profile universities are seen as bastions of liberalism too. Also, union activists, the AFL-CIO, they're also targets in the second Red Scare. So just organized labor in general. Not a lot of people or senators in general are super on board, but they don't want to be accused themselves. So they just sort of go along with it for a little while until we get this man, Edward Murrow, on his See It Now in March of 1954. And I'm going to link a YouTube clip explaining this, where he's sort of the first big person, the first big name to call McCarthy out about this. And I want you to look at this clip, and you can do it better now, where he's talking about how McCarthy is wrong for doing this. Now, when McCarthy really starts losing is when he goes after the Army, and he accuses a lot of high-ranking people, officers in the Army, of being communists. And that's when we get what's known as the Army McCarthy hearings, and sort of the more famous imagery from this time frame comes out. And I'm going to also include a clip from YouTube from Joseph Welch, who was part of the Army McCarthy hearings, where he talks about, at long last have you no sense of decency, Senator McCarthy. So I think that clip will really sort of let you know what's going on during these hearings. And that's when McCarthy sort of fades off into history. But there are some long-term impacts of McCarthyism. Some of them include the loss of jobs and reputation among some high-ranking government officials, people in Hollywood, like the Hollywood 10, for example. There's also civil liberties are threatened in a way that they hadn't been for quite a long time. There's, as part of the First Amendment, people are allowed to say or do what they want as long as it doesn't infringe on anybody else's rights. So this is sort of the first time in a long time in U.S. history that civil liberties of ordinary citizens have been threatened on this level. There's also this anti-communist campaign that turned inward. Now, the whole of America is not they're concerned with communism, but the whole of America in general is doing better, and this is mostly white America here, because we get this affluence after World War II, the affluent society, which also sometimes is the American dream. You can call it. It sets us, the U.S., at odds with the Soviet Union with this development of a consumer society. What we have on the bottom left here is an image of Levittown, New York. This is one of the earlier examples of these suburbs, these sort of copy and paste suburbs that developed outside of cities. This one is in Long Island, so these would be mostly white people, almost exclusively white people, leaving the inner cities, and they would go to the suburbs where there's these cookie cutter houses, and they would drive back into the city to work and come back here to live to their Levittown or their suburb, wherever it happens to be. It's also a time where we talked about a return to traditional values, and that goes along with religion. And this is when one nation under God is reintroduced to or not reintroduced, introduced to the Pledge of Allegiance. It hadn't been there before. Also, at this time, we get "In God We Trust" put on U.S. currency as sort of a check against godless communism. So it's sort of an us versus them mentality. And this is so the flight to the suburbs. To go along with that, we get what's known as domestic containment. We've talked about containment before, and containment we mean keeping communism from spreading. Domestically, what this means is the reinforcement of traditional gender roles, and this can kind of go back all the way to the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution, where there's this idea of Republican motherhood, meaning that a good mother in a Republican society raises good Republican children. And so that's where we get this domestic containment idea. The traditional gender roles, women are supposed to go back home and raise good Republican citizens, and not Republican in the sense of Republican Party citizens, living in a republic. The United States, we call ourselves a democracy, but we're really more of a republic. So that's what we mean when we're talking about this. And here's just an example of, I guess, what a woman's dream kitchen would look like in the 1950s. It actually looks like a pretty nice kitchen even today, but maybe put the laundry machine in a different room. So this is domestic containment. So the whole time frame we're talking about, the affluent society, doesn't exactly extend to everybody. Maybe some women did enjoy being domestically contained, but the other America, we get these pockets of poverty. And so here's children in a North Carolina slum in 1964. You can see that they're just outside of the city. In the background, there's these pictures, or these giant buildings, so that means they're outside the city. And these African American children aren't participating in the affluent society because they are, in general, left out of this affluence. There's still a lot of poverty with African Americans and single women in general. So the affluence doesn't extend to everybody. Sort of this old narrative is being rewritten in recent years. There's lots of racial discrimination still. We'll talk about the civil rights movement a little bit later, but so this is when we're getting the white and the colored water fountains and the colored entrance to these theaters. It's sort of becoming more pronounced in the 1950s, and we'll talk again a little bit more about this in a few weeks. And to go along with that, the Cold War does create some paradoxes in the United States. Even as Americans go on crusading in foreign lands in the name of freedom in places like Korea and later on Vietnam, those freedoms were significantly narrowed at home in an effort to contain communism. Although many Americans also enjoy the affluence of post-war prosperity, others were left behind and excluded from the American dream. And we're talking about others. We're talking mostly about minorities. There's a book I read a few years ago called The Cold War and the Color Line by Thomas Borstelmann, if anybody's interested. And he brings up these examples of racism in the United States that directly contrast with what the U.S. is preaching abroad. And even when foreigners coming to the United States as diplomats, they still experience this racism. Some of the better examples after the World War II, we get the creation of the United Nations, headquartered in New York, like our New York. And so African ambassadors, ambassadors from Africa who were black, they would come over, and if they ever traveled south of Washington, D.C., where a lot of their embassies are, to Maryland or Virginia, where segregation existed, they wouldn't be allowed to sit with white people. So there's this kind of a giant humiliation for them, and this paradox in the United States about preaching equality abroad, but not really expressing it quite that well at home. Okay, so I think that's where we'll end on this one. And make sure you watch. So I've got listed the duck and cover video, this little clip. I want you to watch Edward Morrow on his See It Now, and then the Welch clip. So there's 3 extra YouTube clips, and I think we've got a crash course or 2 that I want you to watch. So that's it. I also want to say that for the most part, you did the hack questions pretty well this week. I left notes on everybody's. I'm not going to leave notes on everybody's moving forward because there's 50 of us, and that's just too many. But so I'm going to, go through and sort of pick out the good ones and the bad ones. And I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. I just want everybody to have a chance to see who's doing what right and who's doing what wrong. That way, we all sort of come together and we can do well on them moving forward. But for the most part, a lot of you did really well. Okay, so thanks, and I will see you next week.